Richard Thompson had always been a man of exact timing. For 15 years, he followed the same routine every single day. Wake up at 5:30, check the Asian markets, grab his coffee, and head to his office by 7 sharp. His billion-dollar tech company didn't run itself, and Richard believed that success came from never breaking a schedule, but today was different. Today, the universe decided to throw him a curveball, the quarterly board meeting that was supposed to last until 6 in the evening got canceled at the last minute. The main investor, an elderly Japanese businessman, had fallen ill during his flight and couldn't make it to New York. Richard found himself standing in his empty conference room at 3 in the afternoon, staring at his watch like it had betrayed him. "Sir, should we reschedule for tomorrow?" his assistant asked from the doorway. "No, let everyone go home early today," Richard replied, loosening his tie. Sometimes these things happen. The truth was, Richard didn't know what to do with unexpected free time. When you're worth $3 billion and your entire life revolves around meetings, contracts, and phone calls, having 3 extra hours feels strange. Most people would be happy, but Richard felt lost. He decided to go home to his penthouse apartment on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. The 40-floor building was one of the most expensive in the city, and Richard owned the entire top floor. It was his sanctuary, his escape from the crazy world of business deals and stock prices. The ride up in his private elevator was quiet. Richard usually came home around 7:30, sometimes 8 if things got really busy. The staff knew his schedule better than he did. His housekeeper always finished cleaning by 4. The chef prepared dinner and left it in the warming drawer, and the building security knew not to bother him unless it was an emergency. As the elevator doors opened into his foyer, Richard expected complete silence. That's how he liked it. His apartment was his peaceful place, decorated with expensive art and rare collections that most people only saw in museums. Everything had its place. Everything was perfect, but something was different today. Richard stepped out of the elevator and immediately noticed sounds coming from upstairs. Not loud sounds, but definitely not the usual silence he was used to. It sounded like someone was moving around in his bedroom area. Maybe in his walk-in closet. At first, he thought maybe the cleaning lady had stayed late for some reason. Rosa usually finished her work by 3:30 and left through the service elevator. She'd been working for him for over 5 years and never once stayed past her scheduled time. Richard paid his staff very well, but he also expected them to respect his space and his routine. The sounds continued. It wasn't just movement. It sounded like someone was doing detailed work. Richard could hear what seemed like fabric rustling and the soft scraping of something against wood. His curiosity got the better of him, even though he really just wanted to change into comfortable clothes and maybe read a book. Richard quietly walked up the marble staircase to the 2nd floor of his penthouse. The sounds were definitely coming from his master bedroom, specifically from the direction of his large walk-in closet. This closet wasn't just for regular clothes. Sure, it had his suits and casual wear, but it also housed his most prized possession. His collection of historical clothing. Most people didn't know about Richard's unusual hobby. While other billionaires collected cars or paintings, Richard collected rare clothing from different time periods. He had medieval robes, Victorian dresses, military uniforms from various wars, and his absolute favorites, a collection of 16th-century doublets that once belonged to European nobility. These weren't just costumes you could buy online. These were real pieces of history, each one worth more than most people's houses. Richard had spent millions building this collection, working with auction houses and private dealers around the world. Some of the pieces were so rare that museums had tried to buy them from him. The doublets were his crown jewels. These were the fancy jackets that rich men wore in the 1500s and 1600s. They were made with incredible detail. Gold threads, silk linings, and buttons carved from precious stones. Richard kept them in special climate-controlled cases with perfect lighting, just like in a museum. As he got closer to his closet, Richard realized the sounds were coming from exactly where his doublets were displayed. His heart started beating faster. Those pieces were irreplaceable. If something happened to them, no amount of money could fix it. Richard moved very quietly across his bedroom carpet. The closet door was slightly open, and he could see light coming from inside. Someone was definitely in there, and they were doing something with his collection, but who could it be? The building security was extremely tight, and only 3 people had access to his apartment: his housekeeper Rosa, his personal chef Miguel, and his building manager Mr. Chun. None of them had any reason to be in his closet, especially not touching his historical pieces. Richard had made it very clear to everyone that the collection area was completely off limits. He cleaned those cases himself and only trusted specific museum professionals to handle the actual clothing when it needed maintenance. The sounds continued: soft scraping, gentle fabric movements, and what sounded like someone working very carefully on something delicate. Richard's mind raced with possibilities. Was someone trying to steal his collection? But that didn't make sense. The pieces were too famous and too hard to sell. Was someone damaging them by accident? Richard reached the closet doorway and slowly peered around the corner. What he saw made him freeze completely. His mouth dropped open, and he felt like his brain couldn't process what his eyes were showing him. There was Rosa, his quiet housekeeper who barely spoke English and always kept to herself. But she wasn't cleaning or organizing. She was sitting at his antique writing desk with one of his most valuable doublets spread out in front of her. The piece she was working on was his prized possession, a royal blue doublet with gold embroidery that historians believed once belonged to a Spanish duke. But Rosa wasn't damaging it or trying to steal it. She was fixing it. Richard watched in complete shock as Rosa worked with tiny needles and thread that looked exactly like the original materials. Her movements were precise and confident, like someone who had done this kind of work for decades. She was repairing a small tear in the sleeve so carefully that Richard could barely see what she was doing. This was impossible. Rosa was a housekeeper. She cleaned bathrooms and vacuumed carpets. She couldn't possibly know how to work on priceless historical clothing. This kind of repair work required years of specialized training and experience that only a handful of people in the world possessed. Richard stood there in his doorway, completely frozen, watching his housekeeper perform what looked like museum-quality restoration work on his most valuable possession. Nothing about this situation made any sense, and Richard Thompson, a man who had built a billion-dollar empire by understanding exactly how everything worked, had no idea what was happening in his own home. Richard's mind went completely blank. He had seen many impossible things in his business career, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. His quiet housekeeper, the woman who had been cleaning his apartment for 5 years without saying more than "good morning" and "have a nice day," was sitting in his private closet performing what looked like professional museum restoration work. He rubbed his eyes, thinking maybe the stress from work was making him see things. But when he looked again, Rosa was still there, still working with the kind of focus and skill that Richard had only seen from the top experts at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The doublet she was working on wasn't just any piece from his collection. It was the crown jewel, the one that insurance companies valued at over $2 million. The royal blue fabric was so old and delicate that Richard barely breathed when he was near it. He had bought it from a private collector in Spain who claimed it once belonged to nobility from the court of King Philip. But here was Rosa, handling it like she did this kind of work every day. Richard watched as she carefully pulled a thread through the fabric. The needle in her hand was so thin it looked like a hair, and the thread appeared to be made from the exact same material as the original. Where did she even get supplies like that? Richard had contacted specialists around the world just to find the right cleaning products for these pieces. Rosa's hands moved with incredible precision. She wasn't just randomly sewing. She was following the original stitch pattern perfectly. Richard could see that she had somehow identified the exact way the original craftsman had sewn the doublet 400 years ago, and she was matching it stitch by stitch. This was impossible. This level of work required years of training at the best restoration schools in the world. Richard knew because he had looked into it himself when he first started collecting. The experts he hired to maintain his collection had degrees from famous universities and decades of experience working with historical textiles. Rosa was supposed to be a simple housekeeper from Ecuador who sent most of her money back to her family. At least, that's what the employment agency had told him when they recommended her 5 years ago. She had good references for cleaning and organizing, but nothing in her background suggested she knew anything about historical clothing restoration. Richard leaned closer, trying to get a better view without making any noise. That's when he noticed something that shocked him even more. Rosa had several tools spread out on his writing desk that he had never seen before. There were tiny scissors that looked handmade, different types of needles arranged in perfect order, and small bottles of what appeared to be various solutions for treating fabric, but the most shocking thing was the notebook, lying open next to her workspace. Richard could see pages covered with detailed drawings and notes. From this angle, it looked like she had been documenting every single piece in his collection. The drawings were incredibly detailed, showing the construction of each garment, areas that needed repair, and what appeared to be historical information about each piece. How long had she been doing this? Richard tried to remember if he had ever noticed anything unusual about Rosa's work. She always finished cleaning on time, never asked for extra hours, and never seemed to spend more time in any particular room. His security system would have recorded if she stayed late, but Richard rarely checked those recordings unless there was a problem. Rosa stopped sewing for a moment and picked up a small magnifying glass. She examined her work closely, then made a tiny adjustment that Richard couldn't even see. The level of care and attention she was showing was the same thing he had witnessed when museum curators worked on his pieces during their annual maintenance visits. Richard's business mind started working overtime. If Rosa really had this level of skill, why was she working as a housekeeper? Professional textile restoration specialists made excellent money. The woman who came to maintain his collection once a year charged him $15,000 for a 2-day visit. Someone with Rosa's apparent abilities could easily make 6 figures working for museums or private collectors. Maybe Rosa was actually working for someone else. Maybe she was documenting his collection for insurance fraud or planning some kind of elaborate theft, but that didn't make sense either. If she wanted to steal something, why would she be repairing it first? And the work she was doing would actually increase the value of the pieces, not decrease it. Richard noticed that Rosa had positioned herself so she could see the closet entrance in the reflection of a glass display case. She was being careful and aware of her surroundings, which suggested she knew she wasn't supposed to be doing this. But her movements showed no signs of guilt or sneakiness. She worked with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and believed it was the right thing to do. The more Richard watched, the more questions filled his mind. Where had Rosa learned these skills? How had she gotten access to professional restoration tools? Why was she working on his collection without permission? And most importantly, how many of his pieces had she already worked on without him knowing? Richard tried to remember any changes he might have noticed in his collection over the years. Now that he thought about it, some of the pieces did look better than when he first bought them. He had always assumed it was just the result of proper climate control and careful storage, but maybe Rosa had been quietly maintaining and improving his entire collection this whole time. The doublet she was working on had a small tear in the sleeve that Richard remembered noticing about 6 months ago. He had been planning to contact his usual restoration expert to fix it, but work had been so busy that he kept forgetting to make the appointment. Now Rosa was fixing it herself, and from what Richard could see, she was doing it perfectly. Rosa set down her needle and gently lifted the doublet to examine her work in better light. Richard held his breath as she moved the priceless garment. One wrong move could damage it beyond repair, but Rosa handled it with the same care that Richard had seen from the world's top museum professionals. She smiled slightly as she looked at her repair work, and Richard could see genuine pride and satisfaction on her face. This wasn't the expression of someone doing something wrong or sneaky. This was the face of someone who loved their work and took pride in doing it well. Richard realized he was witnessing something extraordinary. Either his housekeeper was secretly one of the most skilled textile restoration experts in the world, or she was the most talented amateur he had ever seen. Either way, he was looking at someone whose abilities were far beyond anything he had imagined. but as Richard shifted his weight to get a better view, his elbow accidentally bumped against a small decorative table in the hallway. The table wobbled slightly, causing a crystal paperweight to roll off, and crashed to the floor with a loud crack. The sound echoed through the quiet apartment like a gunshot. Rosa's head snapped up immediately, her eyes wide with shock and fear. For a moment, neither of them moved. Richard stood frozen in the doorway, and Rosa sat motionless at the desk, still holding the priceless doublet in her hands. The secret was out. There was no hiding now. Richard and Rosa stared at each other across the closet, both realizing that everything was about to change. The silence in the room felt like it lasted forever. Richard could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears as he stared at Rosa, who was still frozen at his desk with the priceless doublet in her hands. Her face had gone completely pale, and her eyes were wide with what looked like pure terror. "Mr. Thompson," Rosa whispered, her voice shaking, I can explain." Richard stepped into the closet, his mind racing with 1,000 questions. Up close, he could see even more details that shocked him. The tools spread across his desk weren't just professional grade. They were museum quality. Some of them looked handmade, crafted specifically for working with delicate historical fabrics. "Rosa," Richard said slowly, trying to keep his voice calm, "what exactly are you doing?" Rosa's hands trembled as she gently set the doublet down on the soft cloth she had spread across the desk. Richard noticed that she was wearing thin white gloves, the same type that museum curators used when handling priceless artifacts. Where had she gotten those? "Please don't call the police," Rosa said, tears forming in her eyes. "I know this looks terrible, but I wasn't trying to steal anything. I swear on my children's lives I would never take anything from you." Richard looked around the closet more carefully. Now that he was inside, he could see that Rosa had set up what looked like a professional restoration workspace. She had proper lighting, magnifying equipment, and even a small camera for documenting her work. This wasn't something she had thrown together quickly. This was a setup that had taken time and planning. "How long have you been doing this?" Richard asked. Rosa wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, being careful not to remove her gloves. "About 2 years, she admitted. "But Mr. Thompson, please let me explain why." 2 years. Richard felt his legs go weak. For 2 years, his housekeeper had been secretly working on his multi-million-dollar collection, and he had never noticed. He sat down heavily in the antique chair near his window. "I'm listening," he said. Rosa took a deep breath, clearly trying to gather her courage. "My name isn't really Rosa Martinez," she began. "Well, Rosa is my real first name, but my full name is Dr. Rosa Delgado. I used to be the head textile conservator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art." Richard's mouth fell open. The Metropolitan Museum of Art was one of the most prestigious museums in the world. Their head conservator would be one of the top experts in the entire field of historical textile restoration. "That's impossible," Richard said. "You're my housekeeper. You clean bathrooms and vacuum floors." "I know how it sounds," Rosa said, her voice getting stronger, "but it's true. I worked at the Met for 12 years. I have a PhD in art conservation from New York University, and before that I studied textile restoration in Florence, Italy." Richard stared at her, trying to process this information. If what she was saying was true, then he had been employing one of the world's top experts in historical textile conservation to clean his apartment. It was like discovering that your gardener was secretly a famous chef. "If that's true," Richard said slowly, "then why are you working as a housekeeper?" Rosa's face crumpled, and she looked down at her hands. "Because I lost my job at the museum 2 years ago. There was a scandal involving a piece that turned out to be a forgery. I authenticated it as genuine, and the museum paid millions for it. When the truth came out, I was blamed for the mistake." Richard had heard about authentication scandals in the art world. They could destroy careers overnight, even when the expert wasn't really at fault. Forgeries had become so sophisticated that even the best experts could be fooled. "But that doesn't explain why you're here working on my collection," Richard said. Rosa looked up at him, and Richard could see pain in her eyes. After I lost my job, no museum would hire me. My reputation was ruined. The story was in all the art world publications. I couldn't even get a job at a small gallery. I had to find work somewhere, and the employment agency that placed me here didn't know about my background. I just needed to pay my bills and support my family. Richard was starting to understand, but he still had questions. So you took a job as my housekeeper knowing I had this collection? No, Rosa said quickly. I had no idea about your collection when I started working here. The agency just told me you were a businessman who needed housekeeping services. It wasn't until my first week, when I was dusting in here, that I saw your pieces. She gestured toward the display cases around the room. When I saw what you had, I couldn't believe it. Some of these pieces are things I had only seen in textbooks or museum catalogs. And then I started noticing problems. What kind of problems? Richard asked. Rosa stood up and walked over to one of the display cases. Look at this, she said, pointing to a medieval robe. Do you see how the fabric is starting to separate along this seam? And over here, she moved to another case, the humidity level isn't quite right for this particular type of silk. It's causing tiny cracks in the threads. Richard looked where she was pointing, but he couldn't see what she was talking about. To him, everything looked perfect. I have the climate control system professionally maintained, Richard said. Yes, and it's very good, Rosa agreed. But each type of historical fabric has different needs. Some pieces need slightly more humidity, others need less. Some are sensitive to certain types of light. Your system is set up for general preservation, but not for the specific needs of each individual piece. Richard was beginning to realize that his expensive preservation system might not be as perfect as he thought. So you decided to fix these problems yourself? He asked. At first I'd just watched, Rosa said. But every day I would see the damage. Getting a little bit worse. These pieces are 400, 500 years old. Once they're gone forever. I couldn't just stand by and watch history disappear. Rosa walked back to the desk where she had been working. I started small. Just stabilizing loose threads, adjusting the positioning of pieces in their cases. But then I noticed this doublet had a tear that was getting bigger. She pointed to the sleeve she had been repairing. If that tear had continued to spread, it could have ruined the entire garment. I couldn't let that happen. Richard looked at the repair work she had been doing. Even with his untrained eye, he could see that it was flawless. The new stitching was invisible, perfectly matching the original work. Where did you get the materials? Richard asked. Those threads, the tools, everything? I still have contacts. In the conservation world, Rosa said. People who knew me before the scandal. They don't work with me officially anymore, but they're willing to sell me supplies privately. I've been buying everything with my own money. Richard thought about this. Conservation supplies for historical textiles were extremely expensive. Rosa was earning a housekeeper's salary, but she was spending her own money on museum-quality materials to repair his collection. Why? Richard asked. Why would you spend your own money and risk your job to work on my pieces? Rosa was quiet, for a moment staring at the doublet on the desk. Because this is who I am, she said finally. For 12 years, my job was to preserve history for future generations. Losing my position at the museum didn't change that calling. When I see a piece of history that needs help, I can't just ignore it. She looked directly at Richard. I know I should have asked permission. I know I violated your trust by working on your collection without telling you. But I couldn't watch these irreplaceable pieces deteriorate when I had the knowledge and skills to save them. Richard sat in silence, trying to absorb everything he had just learned. His quiet housekeeper was actually a world-class expert who had been secretly preserving his collection for 2 years, using her own money and risking her job. Because she couldn't bear to watch history be lost, it was the most incredible thing he had ever heard. Richard sat in stunned silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. His mind was spinning, trying to make sense of everything Rosa had just told him. The woman he had known as his quiet housekeeper was actually one of the most qualified people in the world to handle his collection. Show me, Richard said finally. Show you what? Rosa asked nervously. Show me what you've been doing. Show me the problems you found. Rosa hesitated, clearly unsure if this was a trap or if Richard was genuinely interested. After a moment, she walked over to her notebook and opened it to the first page. I started documenting everything when I began working here, she said. At first, it was just habit from my museum training, but then it became necessary as I started noticing issues. Richard looked at the notebook and couldn't believe what he saw. Every single page was covered with detailed drawings, measurements, and notes. Rosa had created what looked like a complete catalog of his entire collection, far more detailed than anything his insurance company had. This piece here, Rosa said, pointing to a drawing of a velvet cape, was showing signs of what we call metal thread disease. The gold threads were corroding and starting to break down the surrounding fabric. She flipped to another page that showed before and after photographs. I was able to stabilize it by adjusting the humidity in that specific case and treating the affected threads with a special solution. Richard remembered that cape. He had bought it 3 years ago for $800,000. If Rosa was right, she had potentially saved him from losing the entire piece. And this one, Rosa continued, showing him documentation of a Renaissance dress, had insect damage that was spreading. Tiny moths had gotten into the fabric and were eating microscopic holes. If left untreated, they would have destroyed the entire garment within a year. Richard felt his stomach drop. Insect damage? But the building has regular pest control. Regular pest control doesn't protect against the specific types of insects that attack historical textiles, Rosa explained. These are tiny creatures that can get through almost any barrier. They're attracted to natural fibers that are hundreds of years old. She showed him more photographs of her work. Richard could see tiny holes in the fabric that he never would have noticed, and then images showing how Rosa had carefully repaired each one. How many pieces have had problems? Richard asked. Rosa flipped through her notebook. About 60%. Of your collection has needed some kind of intervention over the past 2 years. Some were minor issues, others were more serious. 60%. Richard owned over 200 pieces of historical clothing worth more than $50 million. Total, and Rosa was telling him that most of them had been slowly deteriorating. The doublet I was working on today, Rosa continued, had the most serious problem I've encountered. That tear in the sleeve wasn't just from age. It was caused by the way it was being displayed. She led Richard over to the display case where the doublet was normally kept. See how it's hanging? The weight of the garment is putting stress on that particular seam. Every time someone walks by and creates air movement, the fabric flexes slightly. Over time, that tiny movement was tearing the historical stitching. Richard looked at the display setup that had cost him $15,000 to install. But this was designed by museum professionals. Yes, but it was designed for general display, not for this specific garment, Rosa said. Every historical piece is different. What works for one might damage another. She opened her notebook to a section labeled Display Recommendations and showed Richard detailed drawings of how each piece should be positioned to prevent damage. This is incredible work, Richard said, genuinely amazed. This must have taken you hundreds of hours. Rosa nodded. I usually work on it after my regular cleaning duties are finished. Sometimes I stay late, sometimes I come in early. I was very careful to make sure it never interfered with my housekeeping responsibilities. Richard thought about all the times he had come home to find his apartment perfectly cleaned, never suspecting that Rosa had also spent hours working on his priceless collection. Rosa, this level of work... Professional conservators charge thousands of dollars for much less detailed analysis. Why didn't you tell me what you were doing? Rosa's face fell as she looked down at her hands. Because I was afraid you would. Fire me if you knew the truth about my past. What do you mean? Rosa walked over to the window and stared out at the city skyline. Mr. Thompson, when someone in my field makes the kind of mistake I made, it follows them forever. The art world is very small and everyone talks. Even if I had told you about my background, would you have trusted me with your collection after hearing about the forgery scandal? Richard had to admit she had a point. If someone had told him that his housekeeper was a disgraced museum curator, he probably would have been suspicious rather than impressed. Plus, Rosa continued, I needed this job. After I lost my position at the Met, my family was in serious financial trouble. Tell me about that, Richard said gently. Rosa was quiet for a moment, clearly deciding how much to share. My husband died 4 years ago. Cancer. The medical bills used up all our savings, even with insurance. I have 2 children in college. And my elderly mother lives with us. She has diabetes and needs expensive medication. Richard listened as Rosa explained how losing her museum job had been devastating not just professionally, but financially. Museum work pays well, but it's very specialized, she said. When I was blacklisted from that field, I couldn't find anything else that paid enough to support my family. Housekeeping was the only work I could get that provided steady income. And health insurance. So, you've been supporting your entire family on a housekeeper's salary? Yes, and it's been very difficult. There have been months when I had to choose between my mother's medication and my son's textbooks. That's why I was so careful to never do anything that might jeopardize this job. Richard began to understand the impossible situation Rosa had been in. She had the skills to potentially save his collection from serious damage, but she couldn't risk revealing those skills because she was afraid of losing the job her family depended on. But you spent your own money on conservation supplies? Richard pointed out. Rosa smiled sadly. I know it sounds crazy, but I couldn't help myself. When I see a piece of history that's in danger, it's like seeing someone drowning. I have to try to save it, even if it costs me. She walked back to the desk where her tools were laid out. These supplies cost me about $3,000 over the past 2 years. I know that might not sound like much to you, but for me it meant skipping meals sometimes, buying generic groceries, not replacing clothes when they wore out. Richard felt a knot forming in his stomach. Rosa had been sacrificing her own basic needs to preserve his collection, while he had no idea that any of it was even necessary. Rosa, I need to ask you something, and please be honest. Have you ever considered selling information about my collection to other collectors or auction houses? Rosa looked shocked. Never. Mr. Thompson, I know what some of these pieces are worth. I could have easily taken photographs and sold them to competitors or forgers. But that would violate everything I believe in. My job is to preserve history, not exploit it. She opened her notebook to the back section, which Richard could see was filled with security recommendations. In fact, I've been documenting ways you could better protect your collection from theft or fraud. Some of your pieces are so rare that they would be major targets for art thieves. Richard realized that Rosa had been protecting his collection in ways he had never even thought about. While he had focused on buying and displaying his pieces, she had been thinking about preservation, security, and long-term care. Why are you telling me all this now? Richard asked. You could have just apologized and promised to stop working on the collection. Rosa met his eyes directly. Because these pieces deserve better than what they're getting, even with my help. Your collection is museum quality, but it needs museum-level care. I can do some of the work, but there are things that require specialized equipment and multiple experts. If you really want to preserve these pieces for future generations, you need to know the truth about what they need. Richard looked around his closet at the collection he had spent millions building. He had thought he was preserving history, but now he realized he might have been slowly destroying it instead. And the only person who could have saved it was someone he had been completely overlooking for 5 years. The irony was almost too much to bear. Richard watched as Rosa closed her notebook and carefully began putting away her restoration tools. Her movements were slow and deliberate, like someone preparing for the end of something important. There was a sadness in her eyes that went deeper than just fear about losing her job. Rosa, before you pack everything away, I need to understand something, Richard said. You've explained your professional background and your family situation, but there's something else, isn't there? Something more personal about why you care so much about these specific pieces. Rosa paused, holding a small handmade needle between her fingers. She stared at it for a long moment, and Richard could see that he had touched on something very deep. "How did you know?" she asked quietly. "Because I've seen passion before, and I've seen desperation. What you've been doing here is more than both of those things combined. This isn't just about preserving history for the sake of it. This means something very personal to you." Rosa set down the needle and walked over to the doublet she had been repairing. She touched the fabric so gently that Richard barely saw her fingers make contact. "My grandfather," she said, so softly that Richard had to lean closer to hear her. "My grandfather was a master tailor in Seville, Spain. He worked on pieces exactly like this one." Richard felt a chill run down his spine. Suddenly, Rosa's incredible skill level made more sense. His name was Antonio Delgado, and he was considered one of the finest craftsmen in all of southern Spain. Rosa continued. "He didn't just make clothes for wealthy people. He specialized in historical restoration and reproduction. Museums from all over Europe would send him their most delicate pieces." Rosa walked over to her bag and pulled out a small, worn leather portfolio. Inside were old black and white photographs, yellowed with age. "This is him," she said, showing Richard a picture of an elderly man working at a large wooden table covered with fabric and tools. "This photograph was taken in 1962, just 2 years before he died." Richard studied the photograph. The man's workstation looked remarkably similar to what Rosa had set up in his closet. The same type of tools, the same careful organization, even the same intense focus visible on his face. "He taught me everything when I was little," Rosa said, her voice filled with emotion. "Every summer I would spend weeks in his workshop. He would show me how different fabrics were made, how to identify the age and origin of textile pieces, and most importantly, how to repair them without destroying their historical integrity." She showed Richard another photograph, this one of a young girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, sitting next to the elderly man and holding a needle. "That's me," Rosa said with a small smile. "I was 7 when he first let me touch a real historical piece. It was a fragment of a dress from the 1600s that a local museum had brought to him. I remember being so nervous that my hands were shaking." Richard looked at the little girl in the photograph and then at the woman standing next to him. The connection was obvious now. Rosa hadn't just learned textile restoration from textbooks and university classes. She had learned it from someone who had inherited centuries of knowledge. "My grandfather's family had been tailors for over 200 years, Rosa continued. "The techniques he taught me weren't just modern conservation methods. They were the same methods that had been passed down from father to son for generations." She pulled out more photographs showing different pieces that her grandfather had worked on. Richard recognized the style and construction of many of them. They were very similar to pieces in his own collection. "When my grandfather died, I was only 12 years old. My family moved to America shortly after that, and I never got to learn everything he wanted to teach me. But he made me promise something before he passed away." "What was that?" Richard asked, Rosa's eyes filled with tears. "He made me promise that I would never let historical pieces be lost to time if I had the power to save them. He said that every piece of clothing from the past carries the soul of the person who made it and the person who wore it. When we lose these pieces, we lose part of human history forever." Richard understood now why Rosa had been willing to risk everything to work on his collection. This wasn't just a professional obligation or even a personal passion. This was a sacred promise she had made to a beloved grandfather. "So when you saw my collection starting to deteriorate," Richard said, "you couldn't ignore it because of that promise." "Exactly," Rosa said, wiping her eyes. "Every time I looked at these pieces and saw the damage getting worse, I could hear my grandfather's voice telling me to do something about it." Rosa opened her portfolio to a section Richard hadn't seen before. Inside were detailed notes and sketches, but these weren't in Rosa's handwriting. The ink was faded and the paper was old. "These are my grandfather's original notes about working with pieces from this time period," Rosa explained. "I've been using his techniques to restore your collection. The stitching patterns, the thread choices, even the way I prepare the fabric before working on it. All of this comes from knowledge that's been in my family for centuries. Richard examined the old notes. Even though he couldn't read Spanish very well, he could see the incredible detail and care that had gone into documenting these techniques. This wasn't just craftsmanship, this was art. There's something else, Rosa said hesitantly. Something I discovered while working on your pieces that I haven't told you yet. Richard looked up from the notes. What is it? Rosa walked over to a cabinet where she had been storing some of her documentation and pulled out a folder. I've been researching the history of each piece in your collection, trying to understand where they came from and who might have made them. She opened the folder and showed Richard several pages of research notes, photocopies of historical documents, and what appeared to be genealogical charts. I found something incredible about this doublet, she said, pointing to the piece she had been working on. The one that belonged to Spanish nobility. What did you find? Rosa's hands trembled slightly as she showed him a document. According to the historical records I was able to track down, this doublet was made in Seville in 1587, and the tailor who made it was named Francisco Delgado. Richard stared at the document, not immediately understanding the significance. Francisco Delgado was my great-great-grandfather, Rosa said quietly. This doublet that you own, this piece that I've been working so carefully to restore, was made by my own ancestor over 400 years ago. The room fell completely silent. Richard felt like the world had shifted on its axis. The odds of this coincidence were astronomical. Out of all the historical clothing in the world, out of all the people who could have ended up working in his apartment, Rosa had found her way to a piece made by her own family. Are you sure? Richard asked. Rosa nodded and showed him more documentation. I spent months verifying this. I contacted historians in Spain, traced genealogical records, and even found references to Francisco Delgado in museum archives. There's no doubt about it. Richard looked at the doublet with completely new eyes. This wasn't just a piece of historical clothing anymore. This was a family heirloom that had been separated from Rosa's family for centuries, and now she had found it again. So, when you've been working on this piece, Richard said slowly, you've been restoring something your own ancestor created. Yes, Rosa said, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. Every stitch I've repaired, every thread I've replaced, I've been following in the footsteps of my great-great-great-grandfather. I've been using techniques that he might have taught his children, passed down through my family until they reached my grandfather and then to me. Richard sat down heavily in his chair, overwhelmed by the emotional weight of this revelation. Rosa hadn't just been preserving his collection. She had been reconnecting with her own family history. This changes everything, Richard said. Rosa looked at him with confusion and fear. What do you mean? Richard stood up and walked over to the doublet, looking at it with completely new understanding. Rosa, you haven't just been my housekeeper, who happened to be secretly working on my collection. You've been the descendant of the original craftsman, caring for a piece your own family created. He turned to face her. This isn't just about employment or conservation anymore. This is about something much bigger than both of us. Richard stared at the doublet for a long time, his mind wrestling with thoughts he had never expected to have. Just an hour ago, his biggest concern had been what to do with his unexpected free time. Now he was facing a situation that challenged everything he thought he knew about ownership, trust, and what was right. Rosa stood quietly beside him, probably wondering if she was about to lose her job or face criminal charges. But Richard wasn't thinking about punishment anymore. He was thinking about something much more complicated. The facts were clear, but they seemed to contradict each other in impossible ways. Rosa had violated his trust by working on his collection without permission. She had essentially been lying to him for 5 years about who she really was. In any normal situation, this would be grounds for immediate termination and possibly legal action, but nothing about this situation was normal. Rosa had also saved his collection from serious damage, using her own money and time. She had skills that he desperately needed but didn't know he needed. And most shocking of all, she had been caring for a piece created by her own ancestor, Using techniques passed down through her family for centuries, Richard walked over to his desk and sat down, trying to sort through his conflicted feelings. As a businessman, he was used to making difficult decisions based on clear facts and logical outcomes. But this situation couldn't be solved with spreadsheets and profit margins. "Rosa," he said finally, "I need to ask you some direct questions. And I need completely honest answers." "Of course," Rosa replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "First, did you take this job specifically because you knew about my collection?" "No, sir, I swear that's the truth. The employment agency told me you were a tech executive who needed housekeeping services." "They never mentioned anything about historical clothing or art collecting?" "I was as surprised as anyone when I discovered what you had." Richard believed her. The agency he used was very discreet and wouldn't share personal details about their clients' possessions. "Second question, have you ever taken photographs of my pieces to sell to competitors or auction houses?" Rosa looked genuinely offended by the suggestion. "Never, Mr. Thompson. I know exactly how much these pieces are worth, and I know how valuable information about private collections can be. But I would never betray your trust that way, even though you didn't know you were giving it to me." Again, Richard found himself believing her. If Rosa had wanted to profit from his collection, she could have done it years ago and made far more money than she earned as a housekeeper. "Third question, how many other people know about your work here?" "Nobody," Rosa said immediately. "The suppliers I buy materials from don't know what I'm using them for?" "My family thinks I'm just working as a housekeeper. I haven't told anyone about your collection or what I've been doing." This was important for security reasons, but it also showed that Rosa hadn't been bragging about her access to his valuable pieces. "Last question," Richard said, looking directly at her. "If I had known from the beginning that you were a professional conservator, would you have been honest about the problems you found in my collection?" Rosa didn't hesitate. "Yes, if you had hired me as a professional, I would have given you a complete assessment within the first month. Your collection needed serious attention, and any reputable conservator would have told you that immediately." Richard leaned back in his chair, processing her answers. Every response made logical sense, but they also highlighted the impossible situation they were both in, from a legal standpoint. Rosa had clearly overstepped her boundaries. She had worked on his property without permission, regardless of her good intentions. If Richard wanted to pursue legal action, he probably had grounds to do so. The fact that she had helped rather than harmed his collection might not matter in court, but from a practical standpoint, Rosa had potentially saved him millions of dollars in losses. The damage she had prevented and the restoration work she had completed would have cost him a fortune if he had hired museum professionals to do the same work. More importantly, Rosa's connection to the doublet created a moral complexity that Richard had never faced before. How do you handle a situation where someone has been secretly caring for something that was made by their own ancestor? Was it even fair for him to own a piece that had such deep personal meaning to Rosa's family? Richard got up and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. He could see people hurrying along the sidewalks, each dealing with their own problems and challenges. Most of them would never face a dilemma like this one. "Rosa," he said without turning around, "do you think I should own that doublet?" A question hung in the air for a moment. Rosa clearly hadn't expected it. "Mr. Thompson, you bought it legally from a legitimate dealer. You have every right to own it." "That's not what I asked," Richard said, turning to face her. "I asked what? You think? Do you think it's right for me to own something that was made by your great-grandfather?" Rosa was quiet for a long time, clearly struggling with how to answer. "I think," she said carefully, "that historical pieces belong to everyone, not just to the families who created them. My ancestor made that doublet for Spanish nobility, not for his own family. It was always meant to be owned by someone else." But you have a connection to it that I never could," Richard pointed out. "Yes, but that doesn't give me the right to own it," Rosa replied. "My connection is emotional and historical, but your ownership is legal and proper." Richard appreciated her honesty, but it didn't solve his dilemma. If anything, it made the situation more complicated. He thought about his reasons for collecting historical clothing in the first place. It hadn't been about investment potential or showing off his wealth. Richard had always been fascinated by history, by the idea of owning something that connected him to people from centuries ago. But now he realized that his connection to these pieces was nothing compared to Rosa's. When Richard looked at the doublet, he saw a beautiful artifact from the past. When Rosa looked at it, she saw her family's legacy, her grandfather's teachings, and her own life's purpose all wrapped up in a single piece of clothing. There was also the practical matter of Rosa's expertise. Richard's collection clearly needed professional care, and Rosa was arguably the most qualified person in the world to provide that care. She understood the pieces not just from an academic perspective, but from a deeply personal one. But hiring Rosa as his conservator would mean admitting that he had been wrong about how to care for his collection. It would mean acknowledging that his expensive preservation systems weren't adequate. It would mean trusting someone who had been deceiving him for 5 years, even if her deception had been well-intentioned. On the other hand, continuing to employ Rosa as just a housekeeper while ignoring her conservation skills would be wasteful and potentially harmful to his collection. And firing her would mean losing both her housekeeping services and her irreplaceable expertise. Richard also couldn't ignore Rosa's financial situation. She was supporting her entire family on a housekeeper's income while spending her own money to preserve his collection. Her dedication was admirable, but it was also unsustainable. The more Richard thought about it, the more he realized that this situation required a solution that went beyond normal employer-employee relationships. This wasn't just about right and wrong or legal and illegal. This was about finding a way to honor Rosa's expertise and family connection, while protecting his collection and maintaining appropriate boundaries. But Richard also knew that whatever decision he made would set a precedent for how he handled difficult situations in the future. As a successful businessman, he couldn't appear to reward deception, even well-intentioned deception. But as a human being, he couldn't ignore the extraordinary circumstances that had led to this moment. Richard looked at Rosa, who was standing quietly by the window, waiting for him to decide her fate. He could see the fear in her eyes, but also a dignity that came from knowing she had done the right thing, even if it had been done in the wrong way. The decision he made in the next few minutes would change both their lives forever. Richard walked slowly around his closet, looking at each piece of his collection with completely new eyes. Everything Rosa had told him was running through his mind like a movie he couldn't pause. For the first time since he started collecting, he wasn't seeing these pieces as possessions or investments. He was seeing them as living pieces of history that needed care, just like Rosa had said. After what felt like forever, Richard stopped in front of the doublet that had started this entire revelation. The royal blue fabric seemed to shimmer in the soft lighting, and for a moment he could almost imagine it being worn by Spanish nobility 400 years ago. "Rosa," Richard said, still looking at the doublet, "I've made a decision." Rosa tensed up, clearly preparing for the worst. Richard could see her hands shake slightly as she waited for him to continue. "First, you're not fired," Richard said, turning to face her. "But you're not going to be my housekeeper anymore either." Rosa's face went pale with confusion. "I don't understand." Richard walked over to his desk and sat down, gesturing for Rosa to take the chair across from him. "Rosa, I've spent the last 30 minutes trying to figure out how to handle this situation. Like a businessman. But this isn't a business problem. This is something much more important than that." He leaned forward, looking directly at her. "You have skills that my collection desperately needs. You have knowledge that can't be replaced. And you have a personal connection to these pieces that makes you the perfect person to care for them. I'd be an idiot to let you walk away." Rosa stared at him, clearly not believing what she was hearing. "Mr. Thompson, are you saying—" "I'm saying I want to offer you a new position," Richard interrupted. "I want you to be my private collections conservator, full-time, with a salary that reflects your actual qualifications and expertise." Rosa's mouth fell open. "But Mr. Thompson, I lied to you about who I was. I worked on your collection without permission. I violated your trust." Richard nodded. Yes, you did. And normally, that would be the end of the conversation. But these aren't normal circumstances. Rosa, you've been preserving my collection better than I ever did, using your own money and time because you couldn't bear to watch history be destroyed. That's not the action of someone trying to take advantage of me. That's the action of someone who truly cares about what these pieces represent. He stood up and walked over to her notebook, which was still open on the desk. Look at this documentation you've created. This is museum-quality work. You've cataloged every piece, identified problems I never knew existed, and created a preservation plan that would cost me hundreds of thousands of dollars if I hired a team of experts to do it. Rosa wiped tears from her eyes. I still should have told you. Yes, you should have, Richard agreed. But I understand why you didn't. You were protecting your family's livelihood, and you were afraid that my reaction would prevent you from doing what you knew was right for the collection. Richard sat back down, his voice becoming more serious. Rosa, I need to ask you something important. If I hire you as my conservator, will you be completely honest with me about everything from now on? No more secrets, no more hidden work? Absolutely, Rosa said without hesitation. Mr. Thompson, if you're willing to trust me with this opportunity, I promise you'll never have reason to doubt my honesty again. Good, because I have some ideas that go beyond just caring for my collection. Rosa looked puzzled. What do you mean? Richard got up and walked to the window, looking out at the city again. Rosa, what you've told me today has made me realize something. I've been collecting these pieces for my own enjoyment, but I haven't been thinking about their long-term preservation or their educational value. He turned back to her. You said your grandfather made you promise to preserve historical pieces for future generations. Well, I want to help you honor that promise on a much bigger scale. I don't understand. Richard's voice grew more excited as he explained his idea. What if we created a foundation dedicated to preserving historical textiles? Not just my collection, but pieces from all over the world that need expert care? Rosa's eyes widened. A foundation? Think about it, Richard continued. There are probably thousands of historical clothing pieces in private collections, small museums, and historical societies that aren't getting proper care because the owners can't afford professional conservation. What if we created an organization that could help preserve these pieces? Richard began pacing around the room, his business mind now fully engaged with this new possibility. We could offer grants to institutions that need conservation work. We could train new conservators using the traditional techniques your grandfather taught you. We could even create traveling exhibitions that would let people see these pieces while generating funds for more preservation work. Rosa listened in amazement as Richard outlined his vision. Mr. Thompson, something like that would cost millions of dollars. Rosa, I'm worth $3 billion, Richard said with a smile. I can afford it. And more importantly, this would give your work meaning beyond just caring for my personal collection. This would let you preserve history on a scale that your grandfather could never have imagined. Rosa stood up, clearly overwhelmed by what Richard was proposing. You're talking about creating an entire organization around textile preservation. Exactly, and I want you to run it. Me? Rosa's voice cracked. Mr. Thompson, I don't have experience running an organization that size. But you have the expertise that would make it successful, Richard pointed out. We can hire business managers, an administrative staff. What we can't hire is someone with your combination of formal training, family knowledge, and genuine passion for the work. Richard walked over to the doublet that had revealed Rosa's true identity. Plus, you understand something that most conservators don't. You understand that these pieces aren't just artifacts and cases. They're connections to real people who lived centuries ago. That perspective would make our foundation different from any other preservation organization. Rosa was quiet for a moment, clearly trying to process everything Richard had proposed. What about your collection? Who would care for it if I'm running a foundation? Your collection would be the foundation's first major project, Richard explained. We'd create a proper conservation laboratory right here in the building. Your work on my pieces would serve as examples of what the foundation could accomplish. He paused, then added something that surprised even himself. And Rosa, I want to make sure that doublet your ancestor created gets the special attention it deserves. Maybe we could create an exhibit about your family's traditional techniques, using that piece as the centerpiece. Rosa burst into tears. But these weren't tears of fear or sadness. These were tears of joy and disbelief. Mr. Thompson, are you really serious about this? Completely serious. Rosa, 3 hours ago I thought I was just a guy who collected old clothes. Now I realize I could be part of preserving human history for future generations. That's worth more than any business deal I've ever made. Richard extended his hand to her. So what do you say? Will you help me create something that would make your grandfather proud? Rosa looked at his outstretched hand, then at the collection around them, and finally at the doublet her ancestor had created centuries ago. Yes, she said, shaking his hand firmly. Let's preserve history together. As they shook hands, Richard felt something he hadn't experienced in years. For the first time since building his fortune, he was excited about spending money on something. That wasn't about profit or personal gain. He was excited about creating something that would outlast both of them, and Rosa felt something she thought she had lost forever when the museum scandal destroyed her career. She felt hope that she could not only return to the work she loved, but do it on a scale that could make a real difference in the world. Neither of them realized it yet, but they had just started a partnership that would change both their lives and impact the preservation of historical textiles around the world for decades to come. 6 months later, Richard stood in what used to be the entire 40th floor of his building, but now looked completely different. Where there had once been empty office space, there was now a world-class textile conservation laboratory that rivaled anything found in the best museums around the globe. The space was filled with specialized equipment that most people had never heard of. Climate-controlled workstations, digital microscopes for examining fabric at the thread level, and custom-built storage systems that could maintain perfect conditions for different types of historical materials. The transformation had cost Richard over $2 million, but seeing Rosa work in a proper professional environment made every penny worth it. Mr. Thompson, you have to see this, Rosa called from across the laboratory. Richard walked over to where Rosa was working on a medieval tapestry that had arrived just that morning from a small museum in Ohio. The museum couldn't afford professional restoration, so they had applied for help from the Thompson Delgado Foundation for Historical Textile Preservation. Look at this section here, Rosa said, pointing to an area of the tapestry that looked damaged. At first glance, it appears that the threads have simply deteriorated over time. But when you examine it under the microscope, you can see that someone tried to repair it in the 1950s using completely wrong materials. Richard leaned in to look through the microscope. Even with his untrained eye, he could see the difference between the original medieval threads and the modern synthetic materials that someone had used for repairs decades ago. The synthetic threads are actually causing more damage because they expand and contract differently than the original materials, Rosa explained. If we can carefully remove the old repairs and redo them using period-appropriate techniques, this piece will be stable for another few hundred years. This was exactly the kind of work that the foundation had been created to do. In just 6 months, they had helped preserve over 50 historical pieces from 30 different institutions. Small museums, historical societies, and private collectors from around the country were sending them pieces that had been slowly deteriorating because proper conservation was too expensive. How long will it take to fix this one? Richard asked. About 3 weeks if I work on it alone, Rosa replied. But I won't be working alone. She gestured toward the other side of the laboratory, where 2 young women were working on different projects. These were the Foundation's first conservation students, learning the traditional techniques that Rosa's grandfather had taught her. Jennifer is working on an 18th century military uniform, and Patricia is learning how to clean delicate lace without damaging it, Rosa explained. They're both incredibly talented, and they're eager to learn the old methods alongside modern. Conservation Science. Richard watched the students work with the same careful attention that he had first witnessed from Rosa in his closet 6 months ago. It was amazing to see these traditional techniques being passed on to a new generation. "Have you heard back from the university about the research program?" Richard asked. Rosa's face lit up with excitement. "Yes. Columbia University wants to partner with us to study traditional textile techniques from around the world. They're offering to provide graduate students who can help with research while learning conservation methods that aren't taught anywhere else." This had been Rosa's idea. She realized that her grandfather's techniques weren't the only traditional methods that were being lost to time. There were master craftspeople from many cultures whose knowledge was disappearing because there was no formal way to preserve and teach it. We've already been contacted by experts from Peru who work with ancient Incan textiles, and someone from Japan who specializes in traditional silk preservation, Rosa continued. If this partnership works out, we could become a center for preserving traditional knowledge from all over the world. Richard smiled as he listened to Rosa's enthusiasm. 6 months ago, she had been afraid to tell him about her background. Now she was collaborating with universities and experts from around the globe. The foundation had also brought unexpected changes to Richard's own life. He found himself genuinely excited about work for the first time in years. Instead of just focusing on stock prices and quarterly reports, he was learning about history, art, and the importance of preserving cultural heritage. "Mr. Thompson, there's something else I wanted to show you," Rosa said, leading him to a special display area they had created. In the center of the room, in a beautiful custom-made case, was the royal blue doublet that had started their entire journey. But it wasn't displayed alone. Next to it were photographs of Rosa's grandfather in his workshop, copies of his original notes, and a detailed explanation of the traditional techniques he had used. "We've had over 300 visitors come to see this exhibit in the past month," Rosa said proudly. "People are fascinated by the connection between the original craftsman and the modern conservation work." Richard read the placard next to the display. "This doublet, created by master tailor Francisco Delgado in Seville, Spain in 1587, represents the continuation of traditional craftsmanship across centuries. Today, it is cared for by his descendant, Dr. Rosa Delgado, using techniques passed down through 6 generations of the same family. Rosa, do you ever regret not owning this piece yourself?" Richard asked. "I mean, it was made by your ancestor." Rosa thought about the question for a moment. "You know, when I first discovered the connection, I did feel like it should belong to my family. But now I realize that having it here, where thousands of people can learn from it, is much better than having it sit in my living room." She gestured toward a group of school children who were touring the laboratory with their teacher. "Last week, a 10-year-old girl spent 20 minutes staring at this doublet and asking questions about how it was made. She told me she wants to learn how to preserve historical clothing when she grows up. That's worth more to me than ownership." Richard understood exactly what she meant. His entire perspective on collecting had changed over the past 6 months. Instead of accumulating pieces for his personal enjoyment, he now thought about how each acquisition could contribute to education and preservation. "Speaking of education," Rosa said, "I have some news about the scholarship program." The foundation had created a scholarship fund to help students from low-income families study textile conservation. It was Rosa's way of making sure that financial barriers didn't prevent talented people from entering the field. "We've received over 200 applications for next year's program," Rosa said. "Some of these students have incredible backgrounds. There's a young man from Guatemala whose grandmother taught him traditional weaving techniques, and a woman from Nigeria who grew up learning how to work with ancient textile dyes." Richard felt a sense of pride that he had never experienced in business. "How many scholarships can we fund?" "With the current budget, we can fully support 12 students through their graduate programs," Rosa replied. "But I was hoping we could expand that number." "Consider it done," Richard said immediately. "Let's double it, 24 scholarships." Rosa hugged him impulsively, then stepped back, slightly embarrassed. Even after 6 months of working together, she sometimes forgot that Richard was technically her boss. "Rosa, you don't need to be formal with me," Richard said with a laugh. "We're partners in this." And they really were partners. Richard provided the financial resources and business expertise, while Rosa contributed the technical knowledge and passion for the work. Together, they had created something that neither of them could have accomplished alone. "Mr. Thompson," Rosa said, "I need to tell you something. Working here, building this foundation with you, has been the most fulfilling experience of my life. 6 months ago, I thought my career in conservation was over forever. Now I'm doing work that my grandfather would have been proud of, and I'm helping preserve history on a scale I never imagined possible." Richard nodded, understanding exactly how she felt. "Rosa, 6 months ago, I thought success meant having the biggest collection or the most expensive pieces. Now I know that real success means making sure these pieces survive for future generations to study and enjoy." As they stood together in the laboratory, surrounded by centuries-old textiles and cutting-edge conservation equipment, both Richard and Rosa realized that their accidental partnership had become something much more important than either of them had expected. They had created a legacy that would outlast both of them, ensuring that the traditional knowledge Rosa had inherited from her grandfather would continue to preserve history for generations to come. And it had all started with a billionaire coming home early and discovering his housekeeper doing something extraordinary with his doublets.